Hi, my name's Andy. Welcome to Really Random Reads. Today I am going to share a few thoughts with you on The Mayor of Casterbridge by Thomas Hardy, a book that I enjoyed a lot more than I thought I was going to. So I got this as a present, by the way, as well, sort of some years ago. It's some just a little inscription here from 1927, whoever owned it before me. And a friend bought it for me and gave it me as a gift, and I've been outrageously slow in getting around to reading it, probably like 15 years type slow. My relationship with Thomas Hardy was, when I was 16, 17 at school, we read Tess the D'Urbervilles and I enjoyed it greatly, to the extent that in my free time I read Jude the Obscure and enjoyed that even more, which I know is an odd thing to say. If you know Thomas Hardy and you know Jude the Obscure, that's usually the novel that people despise. Then I read Far from the Madding Crowd. So I was on a bit of a Thomas Hardy high. Okay, I was like really enjoying this. And I felt, again, sacrilege, I might get hate in the comments for this. I felt really bored reading Far from the Madding Crowd. And I would be curious to read it again now and see if I still have that perspective. But I think that kind of lingered with me. Then I was working in homeless services for sort of like several years, many years. And there was a guy in one of the services I was working in, and every day he would come to the reception desk, he lived there, and he would tell me about this book, Far from the Madding Crowd, and he would say, this guy had like alcohol-related dementia, so he'd tell me the same thing again and again. He'd come and he'd say, he sold his wife, he sold his wife. And that is the central premise, or the starting premise of this book. So I picked this up recently and read it. And I picked it up because I had done a walking holiday, walking Hadrian's Wall, from the west coast of England to the east coast. And just something about being, it sounds terrible, like make myself feel sick saying this, but something about being out there in nature made me want to come back and read some Thomas Hardy. So I came back, read this, and where was I going, folks? Here's the thing, that premise of the man who sells his wife at an auction, goes to an auction, gets drunk, sells his wife. None of this is a spoiler, okay, this is a setup. Can the rest of that book live up to that premise? Because that's that, and combined with the fact, and again, this isn't a secret, as soon as that happens, not as soon as that happens, but it's well known in terms of that premise. The man, let's say chapter 2, sells his wife in chapter 1. Chapter 2, he's the mayor of the town. So there's a time difference, but the man who sells his wife in an auction becomes the mayor of a town. Again, not a spoiler, okay, that's the premise. Can the rest of that book, because all that happens quite quickly, live up to that premise? And that was what I had always been asking myself after that client that I was working with had repeatedly told me the premise over and over again. He sells his wife and becomes the mayor. I thought, that is a really interesting premise and makes me want to read it. But can the rest of a novel stand up to that? Because it's kind of like, have you shown your best cards by that point? Yes, it can, is the answer. And that was one of the reasons I was so surprised reading this. So here's another thought for you. I'm not going to give any more details away about plot, but what I realised going through this again, I'm thinking back to when I read Tess the D'Urbervilles at school, which culminates in an eerie scene at Stonehenge, and all through Tess the D'Urbervilles and many other Thomas Hardy books, you have this kind of like paganistic thing going on with nature that's quite gothic and uncanny. I was reading this one thinking, is Thomas Hardy really a bit of a horror author? There's a part of it where we're in southwest of England and there's an old Roman, like a mound of earth, and what did used to be apparently a Roman Colosseum from when the Romans occupied Britain. And some of the things that happen in that, some of the imagery of things like the sun being compared to a drop of blood on somebody's eyelid, it reads very much like a horror novel to me. And I like horror stories and found myself really enjoying it. I'm like, am I reading Victorian horror here? Other reasons I enjoyed this. So it's a page turner, Really, really is. And I do not associate Thomas Hardy with that at all, which is weird in a way, because Thomas Hardy came up, he's the reason that we have this phrase cliffhanger. One of his stories, part of a section of one of his stories, literally ended with a character hanging off a cliff. So you would think somebody who has the phrase cliffhanger come into being, you would think that that author would be writing page turners. But I think after I had read Far from the Madding Crowd, and having not found it to be a page turner, and again, maybe I'm being very unfair to that book, I was not expecting what I found here, which was sensationalism, like sensationalist type fiction, almost like melodrama, but in the best possible sense, suspense, and yeah, a page turner. There are intervals of this novel where time is handled really well. So the situation where he sells his wife at an auction and then becomes mayor, you have a gap of time in between that, right? So the page finishes, you turn the page, bang, 20 years have passed. And the way Thomas Hardy shows us some of the things that have happened in those 20 years is very deftly done in terms of suspense and reader shock. There's a load of stuff going on with identity in this, where people aren't who you thought they were and all of that type of thing. Thomas Hardy writes brilliantly about society ganging up on people, about herd mentality, about hypocrisy. There's an episode in this which plays out through letters, which I would argue you can compare to something like revenge porn really today. It feels really, it felt really fresh and relevant and alive reading this. So it could well be up there as my new favourite Thomas Hardy novel. I think I would have to reread Jude the Obscure, but there you go. And by the way, Thomas Hardy, he writes, and it's funny because the man who was telling me every day about this book, he had significant issues with alcohol. He had alcohol-related dementia as a result of them. But Thomas Hardy writes people who have issues with alcohol brilliantly. And I remembered that from Jude the Obscure. And he really does it here as well. He really captures that. If you've been drunk, he captures being drunk really well. And he captures making a fool of yourself really well. But he also, look, he just writes, he writes about alcohol and the problems that alcohol can bring brilliantly. So, if you've read this, I'd be really interested to know your thoughts. I'd be really interested to know if you've read a few Thomas Hardy novels, how this one compares to other ones that you might have read. And there is a really good channel, I'm going to put it on the screen, of somebody who has read all of Thomas Hardy's works and is reading them again. And if you enjoyed this video, I would say go and check her channel out, because she's much more erudite in talking about these things than I am. So I'll give you a bit of a taste of this book and Thomas Hardy maybe. And if you're interested in learning more about him, well, read him, obviously, read his books, but also go and check out her channel out. It's really cool, and I only discovered it recently. Thanks, folks. Bye.